It seems that urgency has gone out of vogue these days, especially during our COVID-19 season of quarantine and lockdown. Everywhere I turn, a podcast, a sermon, or a leadership coach is telling me to slow down and rest. They're telling me to ponder more and do less. Everybody seems to be in a frenzy as they exhaust themselves pursuing the ideal of the non-anxious leader. Even dead people are telling me to slow down and rest. Legendary authors on my bookshelves, Oswald Chambers, Henry Nouwen, Eugene Peterson, Robert Mulholland, Thomas Merton, and others, join their voices with the living spiritual formation writers, who for some strange reason, they always seem to have a middle initial or two. But these modern writers, Richard J. Foster, Marva J. Dawn, Marjorie J. Thompson, and of course, John K.A. Smith, dead or alive, these authors keep on telling me to be a deep, meditative, non-anxious, Sabbath-keeping leader. The pursuit of rest is exhausting me. You see, I've had a lifelong love-hate relationship with the spiritual formation and spiritual discipline section of my library. About the time I feel like a complete spiritual failure in the contemplative space, then I read Mark's gospel and sparks of hope revive me. Here's why. It's because of Mark's favorite word. That word describes how we have always done life and mission in every nation. Here's the word. You ready for it? Immediately. Of the 59 times immediately appears in the New Testament, 41 of the 59 are in Mark's gospel. Why was Mark's gospel in such a hurry? Certainly, at least in part, it was because of his audience. The Romans were aggressive doers. They were people of action, not so much philosophical thinkers. In fact, they hired the Greeks and oftentimes Greek slaves to teach their children while they moved from city to city conquering the world. A second reason Mark is so obsessed with immediate action might be due to his source, Peter. We know that Peter was a ready, fire, aim kind of guy. He probably would have failed as a monk or a mystic, but as a pioneering apostle, Peter changed the world. If Mark had written with John as his source, he might not have ever written the word immediate. Now let's look at the first chapter of Mark. In the English Standard Version, the ESV, the word immediately is used 9 times in Mark 1. The Greek word translated immediately is used 2 more times in Mark 1, so the English translators could have used immediately 11 times in the first chapter. I want us to zero in on the 7th and 8th use of that Greek word, translated immediately, most times, and we'll look at verses 28 and 29. Here's what it says. And at once, and there's that word that usually is translated immediately. So at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. At once his fame spread. Immediately his fame spread. And so as soon as Jesus finished preaching in the synagogue and performing a miracle, his fame spread. As is usually the case in Mark, the shortest gospel, we don't get all the details and we don't get all the other times something like this has happened. Certainly, this is not the first miracle that caused Jesus' fame to spread. So we have a miracle, and then at once, or the word immediately, his fame spreads. Then we're told in verse 29, so the moment fame starts spreading, 29, and immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. As soon as fame and celebrity happened, Jesus immediately got out of the spotlight. He left the public space and retreated to a private home. As soon as fame and celebrity happened, Jesus immediately walked away from the adoring crowd and gathered with his closest friends, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. As soon as fame and celebrity happened, Jesus immediately changed the subject, changed the environment, changed the conversation, and moved it away from fame and celebrity. His disciples never really got it. Remember John chapter 7? The context is the Jews in Judea are trying to kill Jesus, so he's doing his best to avoid Judea. But it was a time for the Feast of Tabernacles. So his brothers, we're told, were pushing him to go to Jerusalem so he could perform his miracles before much larger crowds. Verse 4 in John 7 records the words his brothers spoke, and it exposes their shallow view of ministry. Here's what they said. No one who wants to be known publicly acts in secret. Since you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. Did you see the wrong assumption? They assumed that Jesus wanted to be known, that he wanted fame, that celebrity was sort of the goal. So it made no sense to them that he would continue to do miracles in the tiny provincial towns of Galilee rather than moving on to Judea and especially to Jerusalem. But his goal was not to be known. His goal was not fame and celebrity. Exactly the opposite. Jesus had a clear mission. He came to seek and to save the lost, but there was a strategy to that. A strategy that revolved around a small group of 12 less than impressive young men. They were his top priority. Matthew 5:1, at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, says this, seeing the crowds. The end of chapter 4 paints this picture of these massive crowds that kept getting larger and larger. So verse 1 says, seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And when he sat down, his disciples came to him. Again, Jesus left the crowd to hang out with his 12 disciples. This pattern repeats itself over and over and over in the Gospels. Jesus wasn't impressed with fame or celebrity. His goal was to make disciples, not gather crowds. As you read the Gospels, you'll see that the more Jesus poured into this small group of disciples, the more large crowds would happen. And the more the crowds grew, the more he would retreat and invest in his disciples. Unfortunately, it's way too common today to see ministers and ministries that start out with a focus on making disciples, on engaging the culture and community with the gospel, on establishing biblical foundations and equipping believers to do ministry and empowering disciples to do disciples. But what happens as those disciples start multiplying, then we wake up one day and there's a big crowd. We get so focused on the needs and the demands of the crowd that we no longer have time for the disciples or even with the Father. That's not ministry success, no matter how big it grows. Ministry success is following the Jesus model. That means time with the Father to hear his voice and discern his will, then time with disciples, preferably in a small group. The more we spend time with the Father and time with a small group of disciples, the more likely it is that we will have a large crowd one day. But listen to me carefully. When you get that crowd, I'm talking to pastors, leaders, campus missionaries. When you get that crowd, whatever crowd means in your context, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, whatever it is, please listen to me. Do what Jesus did. Run from fame. Run from celebrity. Don't walk, run. Immediately. When you start to become a celebrity pastor, a celebrity preacher, a celebrity worship leader, a celebrity whatever, get away from the crowd. Change the subject. Celebrity is not healthy for the Christian soul. We were made to worship, not to be worshiped. Yet so many Christian leaders pursue fame. They pursue a following. They pursue celebrity in this social media obsessed ministry culture. We wrongly think that a 7-digit Twitter or Instagram or Facebook following is some type of validation for our ministry. We assume that anyone with a huge following must have actually done something useful. They must have something important to say, and certainly they've accomplished something of value. But that's not necessarily the case. Even if it is the case, celebrity is not something for a spiritual leader to pursue. It's something to run from. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with some communication and social media experts. They told me that they had a plan that could double my Twitter following and my Instagram followers, and it could create this platform that was exponentially larger than what I had. They promised more followers and more influence. I responded with a question after I heard this presentation. Here was the question. Why would I want a bigger Twitter following? Why do I want more people to look at my Instagram? They were puzzled with my question. I tried to explain that I'm much more concerned about the right message for the right following, not any message that will grow a following. I think my lack of interest frustrated those well-meaning social media influencers. When fame happened to Jesus, he immediately ran from it. It might be a good idea for every one of us to follow his footsteps immediately. How do we do that? First, we stop caring how many people like our YouTube video or how many people give a thumbs up on our Facebook post. What matters is the right message to the right audience, not the size of the audience or the audience response. Second, start investing in your private life more than your public life. An inner life that has nothing to do with impressing people that you don't know. And third, go deep with God and a few close covenant friends. Not wide and shallow with random, fickle digital followers who don't really know you and certainly don't care about you, but a small group of close friends you're doing life with. When Jesus ran from celebrity and fame, he ran to a private home with 4 close friends, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Who are your close friends who don't see you as a celebrity leader, but they know you in a discipleship context? Who are your Andrews and Peters and James and Johns? Find those close friends and invest heavily in those relationships. That's the best defense against the poison of fame and celebrity. Listen, when fame starts happening, run from it immediately.